Good afternoon, everybody. The International Parking and Mobility Institute presents today's Shop Talk, Mobility Options and the COVID-19. My name is Justin, and I'll be assisting Robert Ferrin in moderating today's Shop Talk. As a reminder, today's Shop Talk is being recorded. We will make the recording available within 48 hours for you to use and share. Before we get started, I just wanted to go over a few quick housekeeping rules. If you have a webcam and are comfortable doing so, please turn your camera on. IPMI wants everyone to feel engaged and participate. We want to see your smiling faces. We want this virtual Shop Talk just to be like our regular Shop Talks, face-to-face and sharing ideas. As a reminder, all participant lines are muted. We invite everyone to participate. To do so, we ask you to use the raise your hand feature. For online participants, please click on the participant option at the bottom of the Zoom control menu. A separate window will pop up. The raise your hand option will appear on the bottom of the participants menu. Once you press the raise your hand button in the participant menu, it will open to the right of your screen and raise your hand, and you'll be added to the list. Phone participants can use *9 to raise your hands. Once recognized, your microphone will be unmuted and allowed to join in the conversation. You will also be able to type your questions into the chat. Click the chat icon and type your question or comment and click send. We will be reading it to the group. And now I'm going to turn the audience over to Robert.
All right, thanks, Justin. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. It's great to see so many great faces here today. I know that we've all been on this journey now for a few weeks, over a month in some places now, and I always find a lot of comfort in still talking parking and mobility with folks. So I want to kick this off just with a couple stats as we kind of get our arms around what's been occurring. And for those that have been on Shop Talks over the past couple weeks, either in person or also looking at the video recordings, so much has changed, right? So we will be going over some similar things today, but also again, because this is so ever evolving, there'll surely be some new information out there. I kind of want to lead off with a couple things. I'm going to quote the New York Times article from April 9th, which seems like ages ago now, about kind of what COVID-19 is doing to our industry, both parking as well as overall mobility and transportation. Congestion is down, over 60% reduction in roadway use. Air quality is improved. I think we've all seen pictures of no smog in cities and you know, bright blue skies. In some cities, there's been over a 35% reduction in all those emissions. Speeds are up. Obviously, no congestion. Speeds are up, although overall crashes are down, of course, because again, people aren't using our roadways. Bus on-time performance is up. Of course, at the same time, mass transit usage has plummeted. And of course, parking specifically. This again was from the New York Times article. In New York City, at least as of April 9th, there was a 75% reduction in overall parking meter revenue. In terms of a local perspective, what we're seeing here in Columbus, Ohio, especially as it relates to mobility, our transit authority, COTA, has instituted rear boarding. There's also been no fare collection. As of this week, face masks are now required for all riders. And all those riders should be, again, taking those very, very essential trips. Again, based on all these orders, there's been a reduction in routes. There's been a reduction in hours of operation. Our bike share service continues to operate, and I would love again to see to hear and understand what other cities are doing in terms of bike share. Scooter companies are all taking different actions. Some are limiting service. Some have actually stopped service. Others have actually ramped up service. And then in terms of Columbus, we've seen an 85% reduction in parking meter revenue. Mind you, that's a revenue stream that counts for over 90% of our program revenue. So as with most cities, universities, airports, we're all grappling with both the health, certainly the real safety concerns, but also real bottom line issues. Kind of with those stats, I kind of want to kick it off, and I'm going to reach out to my friend David Stein to talk about people management. How is NYC DOT managing staff, both field staff as well as that office staff? So with that, David, how are you today?
Good, thanks, Robert. And I'm happy to see everyone on this call. And certainly, it's been very challenging, trying times for cities and parking in general. As Robert said, one thing I want to just start off with my appreciation. When we always talk about scale, 14,500 meters, 90,000 spaces, where our scale is much larger, but one of the things that the parking family has really helped me is, our leadership has really been struggling on decision making and managing both parking as a resource, but as an operation. We have close to 500 employees that function within parking, and unfortunately, our division, our agency, has been pretty hard struck by the pandemic. Over about 50 employees have had the virus. We've had 2 fatalities, which has been a real challenge just to operate a parking plant, in the city of New York, and to maintain the parking system. I talked about that scale. To date, we have not turned off our meters. So, you can imagine with a really challenging workforce and a stay-at-home order of, the real challenges we've faced. I've been looking to many cities for help and guidance as we've more operationally seen how an agency like ours could actually provide that service. So, that's where we are. I just quickly want to if it's all right, I want to share my screen for a second. I hope this works. If you give me a second. It is not working for whatever reason. But it's all right. Essentially, it is Times Square. If you actually go on EarthCam.
Go ahead and share your screen.
I'm sorry?
You can go ahead and share your screen.
Zoom, let's see. It's giving me it's telling me I have to shut down and then restart. But essentially, it's Times Square right now, and Times Square is completely empty. But it's interesting because, so many city workers and people are considered essential. So, parking as a provision is something that we still have to abide by. And it's really, been a challenge for us to kind of figure out where that parking demand is, how do people pay. There is this fear of people touching parking meters. We obviously cannot be cleaning them on a regular basis. Our maintenance does not allow for that. Same thing, I think Robert was talking about revenue. Revenue is down by about 85 to 90%, depending on where you are. Interestingly, and knock on wood, is our cash payment is completely off. So people are not paying with coins. If people are doing it, we've actually seen people migrate to mobile payment and a little bit more credit card. But it's definitely been a challenge. I think one of the things that we also are grasping with, and I'd be very interested in one of the reasons why I wanted to be on this call is, instituting these sort of targeted improvements. A lot of cities have focused on things like food deliveries, grocery, essential parking. One of the things that I will say that our agency pretty quickly, everyone has seen the level of, the impacts. We were very quick to understand that providing access, especially in a city like New York, to frontline medical personnel look to develop a parking permit management program in order to provide these people. Not only is it to provide them with access and parking around hospitals, but what happens when you suspend your alternate side parking, and many of you have been in New York, it is the bane of existence for all New Yorkers, but with people not driving, when a worker goes to work, what are they supposed to do when they come home from working a 10-hour shift in a hospital? And we successfully, in the span of about 4 days, developed a program, issued 12,000 permits to critical medical personnel at hospitals, and developed a system working with the leadership of about 14 major hospitals to get those permits into the hands of frontline medical personnel. That's something we had never ever done before, and it was quite amazing. I thank Seattle and others. We had conversations, and many of the large cities through the IPMI network, that helped us formulate that. So, we're continuing, going day by day. The best we could do, and hopefully is support, the city to the best extent possible and our decision makers. But, information and data is critical. Things like meter transactions are really helping us, understanding, because there is that demand and there is that need to keep the curb clear. That's a decision the city has made for right now. And I think, Robert, as you said, our revenue is $260 million a year, plus about $750 million of summons issuance a year. So you can imagine the impacts that has on the city budget. It accounts for about 1/80th, I think, was the last number of the city budget, which is small in terms of the overall percentage, but the numbers are very large. And, a lot of times that keeps us, or our agency, to be able to support bike lanes and other projects. So, one of our fears is that without this revenue stream, when we do emerge from this, we're not going to be able to be as nimble. And Robert, like you said, there are other programs that are associated with parking revenue. So that's where New York City is. My phone and my email are always open. I'm always eager to help, or, as many times I'm going to reach out to many of you for help as well.
Thanks, David. I think when you were talking about kind of staff and staff being out there, and then, unfortunately, staff getting sick, sick as well as passing away. What is New York City thinking about, and then also others about protective measures, PPE? I know on our team we're having all these discussions about just trying to get access to anything for cashiers and enforcement officers, refuse drivers, you name it. What's New York City thinking about in terms of those kind of measures? And then I'll open up to others.
Yeah, so in terms of the protective measures, the fact that when I say we're a division of 500, we're also an agency of 5,000, operating everything from ferries. So the city has, to date, been able to accumulate and have a good level of PPEs. The problem is a lot of the things that we do from an operational perspective. So a collection vehicle has 2 individuals in it, right? How could you social distance? So, those are the sort of things where, both by going to a reduced workload and also kind of changing some of our SOPs, we've been able to conserve PPEs. And also, understand, look, even, float on the street we've changed our policies. If there's a meter that needs to be collected, there's a lot more money on the street, but we understand that the health and safety, of our employees is critical first and foremost. And even, when we talk about things like wiping down meters, I know some of the smaller cities have had, the ability and the resources. That's where we've really been struggling, is not so much the PPEs, but how do you kind of effectively maintain an operation? So people are using tools. Everything we do is touch surfaces, whether it's a meter or counting coins. Those are the real challenges, I think, that we've never really thought about something like this. And, as this goes on, I do know, we've been relying very much on our emergency management in the city of New York. The one thing I will say is I don't directly supervise a lot of the operational groups, but the unions have actually come through in many cases of helping support their employees. And that's something that I've been, very grateful for, where they've been able to accumulate and collect, whether it's face masks or gloves, and provide those to their employees. And that's something that's been a real great thing that I think that has unexpectedly helped us.
Thanks, David. As we kind of move in and talk about mobility services, I know that obviously the parking industry has certainly changed levels of service, customer service. When we think about kind of our fleets and our bike shares and things like that, I'm going to call on Perry out in UC Davis to kind of talk about the parking mobility market there, specifically as it relates to some of these services, especially for a university setting where kids have been sent home and yet there's still functions occurring.
Yeah, bicycling is still big around Davis, and it's something important we do, and we've been focusing on that. A lot of our issues is just dealing with security on the campus. A lot of vandalism going on, and also a lot of bikes were left. And so we're just trying to provide the security for those folks and their bicycles. We don't have the storage facilities to take those bikes in. But something I've noticed on the campus is still there's a lot of folks that are social distancing. Bicycling is still important on our campus, and that's something we're encouraging, of course, in a safe way.
Thanks, Perry. I'm going to put, I see one of my fellow board members, Brian Shaw, on the line here. I'm going to put Brian on the spot here. I can talk a little bit about what Stanford's doing in terms of parking mobility. I know that you're one of the first groups to go fully virtual. You've been social distancing for a while, but can you talk a little bit kind of how your operation's reacting to this?
Sure, Robert, thanks. We anticipated this happening probably 2 weeks out from when the governor gave the order and the mayor of San Francisco gave the shelter-in-place order. And we had our folks start taking their computers home with them every night. They weren't in the habit of doing that, and start practicing working from home. Probably about half our staff was doing that. The other half was not. They just didn't need to. So we tried to get ready in anticipation of having to work remotely. And when the order came, we were basically ready. We had spent the previous 2 years developing a virtual permit system at Stanford, not having a retail counter anymore, and people were used to interfacing with us on the phone or online. And so we could disperse our staff to their homes and they could continue to do their work. We did have to suspend parking enforcement. That was arguably the first decision that we made that affected the campus. We had to do that really because of the hospitals. We have 2 hospitals on campus, a children's hospital, adult hospital, and they are in full COVID mode. Their staffing levels had increased tremendously, patient loads had increased, and so they needed more capacity for parking. And so making parking free and suspending enforcement gave them the ability to bring more people to the campus for their purposes. We set up a test center in one of our larger parking lots for the hospitals as well. And really our job became more about supporting them and focused on their needs primarily, and then looking at what do we not need to be doing now? What services can we begin to cut back, scale back to help save money? Because unlike New York City, I'm not able to continue to charge for parking, and we're losing money every day that we don't. And so the only way we can make up for that is by scaling back services that are no longer needed, but factoring in the hospitals and the services they still need. So it's been a balancing act in coordinating, cutting back services the university no longer has a purpose for, but the hospitals still may. And so we continue to coordinate that. We've also been tremendously impacted by the continuous cuts to public transit services in the Bay Area. The stimulus money will help, but that's going to be a ways out and coming. And all the agencies in the Bay Area, and we have 27 of them here, have all scaled back or curtailed their services, and we've had to react to that accordingly with our bus operations. And because I have union drivers, there's a process for that. It takes us 2 weeks to cut service. I have to honor their collective bargained rights to determine how that work is going to get allocated across their members. And that doesn't happen in 2 or 3 days, but I've literally had schedule changes and service cutbacks by the various agencies that have happened within that 2 to 3 day time frame. And it takes us, like I said, 2 weeks to respond. So I've had a series of bus schedule changes that have been rolling out. I have another one coming next week that's in response to a change in the public transit system that happened a week ago. So that's been a constant sort of issue for us to handle and try to work our way through that. It's not been easy. We've also had to scale back some of our TDM programs. We are no longer offering our Clean Air Cash program, which essentially pays people not to drive. And that's for 2 reasons. One, most people are not who work at Stanford coming to the campus anymore. They're working remotely. And 2, parking is free, and there's no longer revenue coming in to pay for that program. So we suspended that program for the time being. Our van pools are still operating. About half are running, the other half are idle. We haven't decided to end the leases on those yet. That is something we will keep in consideration. But the challenge with this, and you all are struggling with this too, is these shelter-in-place orders are made for 2 weeks, and then it's made for a month. And now we're sort of like, is this going to go into May? And how far into May? The state here in California has not announced its extension in a particular finite way, and the Bay Area counties and cities have not announced that they're extending it beyond April, although Los Angeles has extended theirs into May. So it's hard for us to sort of make these longer term decisions. When I have a 30-day lease on a van pool, you know, I needed to decide about May last week. So it's hard for us to keep up with these changing issues, and that's a struggle we all have. The university is basically a virtual facility now, and that's very weird. As most of you know and can see behind me on my screen, Stanford is a beautiful place, and part of its charm and part of its allure is what it is physically, and there's hardly anybody there now to appreciate that. We have 500 undergrads on campus, a lot more graduate students because they have nowhere to go in large part. You know, they're adults, they're home at Stanford. We have PhD students who are on campus for years at a time. They don't have any other place to go. So they're still around, but they're having to shelter in place, and they are. But it's a weird place now, the university, because it's not designed to function this way. And for how long we have to do that, nobody knows. But all summer's been canceled. There are no summer classes. There's no summer programs, which for my department is significant. We make a lot of money off parking for conferences and events and athletic camps and things like that, and that's gone. So I think for universities, this is a very challenging situation because our revenue for most of us is now zero. And how do we function in that environment where we still have to provide some services for the university? It's a difficult position, and hopefully we can find our way out of it soon.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, I think, here in Columbus, obviously very similar to Ohio State, everything's virtual. My wife's upstairs taking virtual classes right now. And, I think we're all kind of hoping for, fall football season, and obviously who knows if that's going to happen, but we're all still having to deliver a service with not a lot of revenue. I think it's good for us to continue to focus on what services can we deliver that's going to give us purpose, it's going to give our frontline staff purpose. I want to get one more city perspective. Cynthia, if you're still on the line over in Houston, kind of talk a little bit about what you're seeing from the Houston parking as well as overall transportation perspective. See if Cynthia's still on.
Cynthia, if you have a phone, you can press *6 to unmute the line.
Now?
Yep, we can hear you now.
Okay. Good afternoon or morning, wherever you guys and gals are. My assistant director is Maria Ershoff. All y'all are familiar with that name. And it hasn't impacted us. I'm going to read it so that way I don't miss anything. Half of our office staff is telecommuting, of which I'm one of them. And for those of us in the city, because we stay so busy, we're able to focus some time on some catch-up work. And that's one of the things that we're doing. We're doing our compliance officers and our meter shop technicians are assisting other departments, more specifically the monitoring of parks. Like New York, our meters, we are still collecting revenue from those. Of course, not as much. We used to have Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday heavy collecting. Now it's only on Wednesday. That's, of course, much lighter. We stopped booting on March the 8th. We used to have 3 shifts, of which we worked from 6:30 to 3, 8 to 4:30, and then a 3:30 to midnight shift. Now, which is only 2 shifts, only 8 to 4:30 and 6:30 to 3:30 p.m. And we are only issuing safety violations. We have provided masks and gloves and hand sanitizers for our field staff. And one of the things that we have changed is we gave our customers and citizens the option to contest citations 7 days online or 30 days in person. That has been completely changed. You have 60 days to contest. And that's pretty much how it has been. And of course, like everybody else, maybe not like in a university, but our revenue for our meters definitely has nosed up because, well, everyone's stay at home. But so far, from no one, I have not been informed that anyone within our staff or family have been impacted by the virus as of yet. So we're pretty glad about that.
Thanks, Cynthia. I think as we look at how we plan for things, whether it's technology enhancements, parking plans, mobility plans, we're obviously all reacting, cities, universities, airports. I'd love to get the consultant perspective here. I know in Columbus, we're still working on major mobility plans that probably wouldn't be put in for years. But I'm going to reach out to Tom here from Walker, who's still on the line, to kind of talk about how your segment of the industry is reacting, and hopefully still helping us all out here. So Tom, good morning, good afternoon.
Tom, if you're on the phone, you can press *6 to unmute your line.
There we go. Good morning, good afternoon. Is everybody safe? Good to see you guys. From the consulting perspective, I mean, we're affected just like everybody else. Business maybe isn't as, it's got a different feel to it. It's not as intense maybe as it once was or has been recently, but there's segments of our business that are doing well. The restoration groups seem to be picking up business because there's room in the facilities now with less vehicles parked in. They can do site visits and maybe preempt some work. That leads to a good point. I noticed today in Florida, the governor advanced some major transportation projects because there's not as many vehicles on the road. I'm sure there are other states doing the same. So, in that vein, what I think I'm noticing, and I know I've got some of my colleagues on this webinar as well, that, in certain clients that maybe have more time than they had before to concentrate on studies or look at opportunities for studies. I mean, mobility, was something everybody was wanting to look at, and now we've got some time in a lot of instances to look at it. It's also changed a lot, right? Because there's not as much traffic today. There's not as much folks using parking, so there may be opportunities to make some changes. I've got a client in particular that I'm thinking about that, has taken the opportunity with the less in traffic and a kind of a new way of doing business to create some on-street curb management changes, and that creating drop-off pickup zones that weren't necessarily there before, because wants to support the local businesses and eateries that are still trying to stay open with the deliveries or the pickups from the restaurants. So, will that stick afterwards? Perhaps, and maybe that's a good thing. That may have had resistance before this happened, and now that it's in place, it may be something that sticks going forward. But another client I'm thinking about, working on a study and analysis where the data was actually great, pre-COVID-19 pandemic. We did a great analysis for them, thinking that, everything was going to continue on as normal. Then this happens, and so the data becomes, it's valid once things get back to normal. And then as it continues, now there's some panic because we've got bond payments we've got to consider, right? So now I have to recast my analysis to consider, how do we become more aggressive? Instead of just taking the analysis as it is, what can I do to be more aggressive to make up revenues, make up, those bond payments I have to make in the future? And it leads to another question of, once we do get back to normal, well, heck, who knows when that will be, but how long will it take? Will people come back to work now that everybody's used to working from home? Are you all going to go back to work because you have to, or you want to, or, does traffic, I'm sure it will eventually get back to that pace, but how long? Are people going to hurry back to work because they miss it so much, or are we going to slow play this into the wintertime? There's a lot of unknowns and a lot of questions that maybe we weren't thinking about before. And then when you throw in important things like bond payments that you have to be obligated to hit, that really changes how our policies and especially some of my clients' policies have to be considered going forward. So yeah, it's certainly changed the way we look at things and how we have to question what the old normal was and give guidance on what the new normal could be.
Thanks, Tom. I've begun to think the same thing about what does that new normal look like, and there have been some positives that have come out of this, especially when it comes to congestion and air quality, huge benefits, and what are things that we can kind of be thinking about as we get out of this to kind of plan ahead, and are there opportunities to quickly implement things? I know that quite a few of us were in Brooklyn late last year talking about, among other things, curb lane management, and how do we look at managing that curb for not just parking, but for shared mobility devices and buses, loading zones. And now that we've essentially been given a clean slate, at least when it comes to overall demand, are there opportunities for kind of quick wins, still keeping in mind, again, that budget, that bottom line? I know one thing we're doing here in Columbus is we're tracking everything. So, we've all made a bunch of changes. We've put in 30-minute meters. We've suspended penalties and fine accumulation on our tickets. We've suspended hearings. We're keeping track of all that, because not that everything will go back to the way it was pre-COVID, but at least we have a sense, as we're kind of running around our heads cut off sometimes, making sure that we have inventory of all that. I know one city that's been making a lot of moves is our friends out in Seattle at SDOT, and put Mike on the spot here. I know Mike and his team has done a lot when it comes to curb lane management, both around hospitals as well as facilitating food trucks, pickup and drop off. Love to get an update on how things are going since probably last week.
Sure. So we've been doing a lot of things that other cities have been talking about. We've installed, I think to date, over 350 food priority pickup zones, where restaurants, as a lot of cities are open for takeout. We've been both reacting to requests for those food priority pickup zones, but also one of the things my staff can do is proactively contact some of those restaurants and see if they want priority and access at the curb. We've established, as David talked about, and some of this with his direct help in input to us, hospital staff parking adjacent to facilities, medical providers, even food service providers who need access at the curb for their staff who can no longer take the bus and don't have a lot of good options off street. So we've stood up a permitting program and issued over 1,000 permits and converted over 100 blocks to hospital staff parking. And so kind of building off some of what Tom was talking about, we're also sort of planning for recovery. So of the things that we're doing, what are the things that, you know, are temporary and what are the things that start to stick? We've been able to sort of jumpstart the prioritization, kind of reprioritization of our curb and thinking about these loading zones, especially for restaurants and things like that, and what it looks like for us in the future to think about whether some of those areas should stick, and starting to talk with our neighborhood business districts about stuff like that. We turned off paid parking a couple weeks ago, saw a lot of the same numbers, and decided also to support physical distancing that we weren't going to require people to come out and pay for parking. But we're doing some planning to think about what it looks like to bring that back. So if we've had paid parking rates from 50 cents an hour to $5 an hour in the past, and now we're down to 0, what does it look like for us to start to bring some of that stuff back that is sort of data-based and supports the business districts and doesn't go all the way back from 0 to $5, but really takes sort of a data-driven approach to think about how we are supporting those neighborhood business districts as they sort of transition back to what is hopefully a vibrant post-COVID time.
Great, thanks, Mike. Justin, I think we have a question from the chat box.
Correct. It's a combination of chat and question and comment. This is from David Stein from New York. One big question I continue to ask is, will COVID-19 accelerate the transition to meterless or asset-light curbs? We are challenged with signs and meter programs. Going virtual makes this a lot easier. There has been a movement in many cities as they are moving past the first generation pay stations. Is the meter itself dead or dying?
You know, I'll take that first one and then I'll pass it off to others. You know, we introduced mobile pay only zones in Columbus last year, and we've seen some good success. And we kind of had a plan to start rolling those out in other areas. And I think, yes, I think this gives us that window to kind of move more in that direction. I think you still have to consider those that are unbanked. You have to think about kind of those data technology considerations, but there are ways to overcome those. And I think as we think more thoughtfully about hand hygiene and social distancing, you know, what technologies can we have out there that can help support these things and also make us more resilient? I try to be that eternal optimist. That being said, this could come back again and again, and how do we try to create probably better footing for the next go around? I think absolutely going asset light will help us on the bottom line side, as well as on the social distancing side, but would love to hear others' feedback on that.
Feel free to raise your hand. Okay, Brian Shaw.
Brian.
I couldn't agree more, Robert. We opened a campus last spring in Redwood City, and we made the strategic decision to not install any pay stations in that campus. It's all through mobile payment. And now we're beginning to look at adding not just the one mobile payment platform that we've had for years, which is Park Mobile, but adding a couple others because now in Redwood City, they have pay by phone. And so now you've got two, and it just doesn't make sense to make people use two different apps to park literally feet away from each other. So I think what's going to happen is you're going to see places begin not just to have an exclusivity with the mobile payment platform, but maybe offer 2 or 3 or more so that folks have the ability to use whichever one they want. And you've made it simpler for them, arguably, to do that. So I think the days of the parking field hardware are coming to an end, and crises like these with this virus can push things forward that were already beginning to happen, as you mentioned. And I think people are not going to want to touch public infrastructure as much as they were in the past, and to not be dealing with meters and pay stations and pay equipment and ticket spitters and all that sort of stuff we just take for granted. The technology allows people to no longer need to interface with equipment and to be touching it in order for them to pay for their parking. That's what we've done at Stanford in large part, and we're considering doing that in a much bigger scale and eventually getting rid of all of our meters and all of our pay stations.
Yeah, I think, Brian, on the topic of going asset light, people not wanting to touch infrastructure equipment. Mark Santos with Desmond, what is your shop kind of thinking about when it comes to both on street as well as off street, especially the off street side? Things are already going LPR based, but what are y'all thinking about in terms of this issue right now? Thought so, Mark.
Mark, if you're on the phone, press *6 to unmute your line. I think he got kicked out. He's joining back in again. While he's getting logged in, Raymond Chan posted, there was a heavy resistance from various groups representing seniors, credit card, debit card patrons, privacy groups with the Long Island Railroad considering eliminating cash.
I think that's just one of those challenges. I can let David speak to that too if he wants, but I think that is one of the considerations when you start looking at a cashless environment. I know we're creating a common payment system as part of our Smart Columbus project where the unbanked can still build out an account that then could be a payment method on both the on-street parking as well as on our transit system, scooters, et cetera. So those are things to consider. There are certainly those barriers still, I think, as this crisis presents itself and some of the challenges you have with public infrastructure out there, you start to weigh those options, right? And I think as we move through this further and further, I think while those are still significant challenges, I think they can be overcome. I see Mark is back on the line. Hey, Mark.
Hey, sorry about that. My Wi-Fi is being tested today with my kids about to join a couple Zoom calls. So if there was something towards me, I think I missed that question.
Okay. No, that's fine. I've got 7-year-olds on Chromebooks. I mean, we're all testing our internet capability. Just very small sidebar. We've spent years investing in broadband technology at schools and workplace, and now we've abandoned those locations, and we're all essentially using like old dial-up for all this. So, Mark, talk to us about what Desmond's thinking about with regards to, what are the long-lasting effects of this. Is maybe people don't want to touch pay stations anymore. Maybe people don't want to touch parking meters. From a garage and on-street perspective, what's Desmond thinking about?
Well, I think I don't know if we're in that depth of level of specificity, but I think, trying to build up upon my fellow FPTA board member, Tom Zubka, a lot of it comes down to is we're just thinking about, and this may not be directly answering the question, but I think from our standpoint, we're both off-street, on-street, we're really thinking about what is really the new norm of parking demand. Because, we're all thinking about what's our new norm with, lifestyle and school and all that. But at the end of the day, some of the things that we're thinking about are current parking zoning codes and requirements, minimums, maximums. All of those might be out the door, which then have obviously a clear effect on what is the on-street parking that's going to be required? What is the off-street parking that's going to be required? And a lot of the things we're thinking about pertain to, what's active for us right now is, some opportunities within the, assessment and restoration phase, which is great. But when you fast forward a little bit, are those facilities going to be maxed out, when our new norm comes back at 85, 90% or something like that? So, for us, we're, I guess, a little bit all over the place where we're not necessarily diving into something, as ingrained into meters or equipment quite yet. We're still kind of like 30,000 foot level of trying to make sense of what this all means for our industry, because it's just wild to think that something can happen so fast and have such a big impact. And everyone here on this call is probably doing the same thing of learning, not also interacting with folks, which is great, that you're not related to. But it's also just hearing about what folks are thinking about, because I think the more we have these shop talks and the more we talk about, it's just helping us come to a place that we think, that I think the folks on this call will be a great part of where this industry heads to. So, Robert, I apologize. It's just Rachel knows this and others. I don't typically stay on track, but that's just kind of where I would say myself and Desmond, we're just, still a little bit at the higher level right now, trying to make sense.
No, absolutely. That's great. I think you made some good points about kind of how is this going to fundamentally shift things. I know Kevin has some in the chat box about, and we kind of talked about this, curbline management strategies. What are people thinking about in terms of monetizing those? Because at the end of the day, as has been said multiple times today, revenue still has to come in. We still have to pay off debt service. We still have to pay our folks and pay for all these services. And I think we've all struggled with how do you monetize a curb space that doesn't have a physical meter, doesn't have kind of that more traditional parking session. I know just for Columbus's perspective, we just finished up a 6-month pilot with Curb Flow on looking to monetize the curb. There were some really great lessons learned from that. We're now reevaluating, especially based on what's happening now, about what the long term looks like for loading zones. Our team, especially with a lot of those folks working remotely, we're now developing a loading zone management RFP that hopefully will hit the street later on this year to kind of reach out to the market and say, we want to think differently about the curb. It may not be the single or multi-space meter. It may look a little bit different. But I think we all probably have to hit the fast forward button on this a little bit because parking revenues are not going to come back right away. I'm seeing projections where we're not even at 85% of revenue until the fall. So how do we get through the summer? So what other things can we do? Rachel, I'll pass it off to you for a minute to chime in here.
I wish I could solve the revenue equation for you, but it's obviously a long-term play, what we're looking at, depending on the research that's coming out. We may be looking at successive closures and openings, right? So again, no one has the crystal ball, but some of the conversations we're having now, and that'll be the topic of our shop talk on April 29th, is planning ahead for the return to work, the return to school, whether it's staggered, whether it's still at social distance, what that looks like, right? So for the first conversation on that, we're gonna look at on-street versus off-street because those are two very different pieces of the puzzle. So if if I'm called to an important meeting in Philly and I absolutely have to go there, I'm probably parking on street. I'm also definitely using pay by cell, you know what I mean? Pay with app, whatever, or I risk a ticket. Right, candidly, those sorts of things, like what does that look like and how can we prepare appropriately and protect our people? So I know that is not necessarily the topic of our conversation today, but I wanted to let you all know because you're here and you're engaged that, we're basically planning some small group work on this to prepare for that April 29th, because you may not have the focus and the ideas right now to say prepare an SOP for crisis management or improve upon your current policies and procedures. But what we would like to do as IPMI is provide that resource for you. If you have great new ideas on things that you're putting into your crisis management, or you're thinking about coming back to work, or you're even just come up with a great cleaning protocol that we can share, let us do that for you. And by all means, give us a list of sort of what are you thinking about, knowing that some areas are harder hit than others, you know what I mean? Seattle, LA, New York, Philadelphia, maybe in the middle of the country who's going to still see this come towards them. So I'd encourage you to, be thinking about that for us. But I don't know if you have any other, needs that you kind of want to put out there. You could certainly put them in the chat box, send us a note, but looking at being that clearinghouse for those policies and procedures so that we're not reinventing the wheel and that we are working essentially as a team to share those resources.
Hey, Rachel, I'm going to read a few comments that have come through the chat here. Raymond Cheng wrote, with a lot of talk about the economy going into deep recession for a time period, I think municipalities would consider eliminating charges for parking to spur more people to shop. Has anybody considered continue to charge for parking, but just not advertise that enforcement has stopped?
Anybody want to take that one?
I don't run a parking program, but what I will say, some of the, resources that we've heard through the blog and the magazine are that it's actually really important to continue to monitor the curb. Because you actually have congestion from deliveries. You have food deliveries. You still have people taking Uber and Lyft for certain, essential personnel. Transit is in many cases at a standstill. In Philadelphia, SEPTA is on emergency ridership. It's really difficult to find a bus. If you have to take a bus to work, you're going to have a tough time these days. So making sure that the curb is actually accessible to those individuals who need to be out and about, like stopping enforcement. I understand you're talking about like a different approach to enforcement. No, we may not be out ticketing, but I know a lot of folks are out like eyes on the street. How can we help? They're doing food deliveries. They're out and about in a different way rather than just your typical enforcement.
And Rachel and Rob, I mean, I think the challenge in New York and many other places is we're a city of neighborhoods. So, I mean, people think of Manhattan, which is virtually empty curbs, but you go into these retail, residential districts where parking is scarce. We don't have RPP. And I think, it's finding that balance between regulation, pricing, and enforcement. Today, you go into these neighborhoods, it's mostly shop owners who are keeping their shops open, parking for 8 hours. They are feeding the meter. They're complaining. They said, I pay the meter, but I'm getting a ticket because, the officers are using discretion. But, I've always seen revenue collection as secondary, but it's about getting those three elements right now and in the coming months that I think are really going to, help these businesses. It doesn't help when, a grocery store is getting a delivery in a 53-foot trailer and there's a line of vehicles parked outside of it. That's in the COVID scenario or, in general. I think that's something that we're all going to have to rethink. I'll just give, we also were planning on a rate adjustment. The budget comes out in a day and it was removed. It just doesn't look good politically to say, hey, we're raising parking rates when, we're in the middle of possibly a major recession. But, in the coming months and years, transit agencies and government's going to look to, address revenue. And one of the things that we've been talking about is creatively, my staff, who's actually not working as much on kind of operational stuff, is, where can we find things like food truck regulations? And really, like all the things that we've always wanted to do, how do you kind of create those programs? I think, Rob, you talked about an RFP. Now's the time to get those kind of programs in place to start thinking about that. So, I mean, I think hopefully in the coming months, a lot of consultants and parking industry will be very happy with cities kind of coming to them for some of these ideas and things that, whether it's commercial deliveries, permitting, regulatory, signage, these are the things that we're looking to monetize in the near future, not necessarily for revenue, but to have a better functioning curb.
Absolutely. Justin, do we have any other chats in the chat box?
Yeah, we have time for one more discussion here. Let's see, I'm gonna go to Mike Essie's. Something we've been talking about a lot here right now is yes, but hard times to introduce new monetized features when everyone is looking for fee relief for things like permits. That does include some value for the curb. For an example, car share permits, temporary construction permits. But I think there is much more awareness and value for those micro uses and transactions at the curb. And how do we more effectively value, prioritize, ultimately monetize those things?
That was a big one, Mike.
I was just kind of responding to a question from Kevin, actually. Kind of the same thing. And, I think there's a greater recognition now for the value of the curb than in some ways there was before. And the question is there a way to monetize that? We talked about that in Brooklyn last year as part of the IPMI get together. The right answer is we are starting to try to think about those and talk about those things. Politically, it's just a really challenging time. Again, when everybody is looking for fee relief, it's a hard time for us to introduce a new fee, even though I think there's a recognition and value for that updated type of use of the curb. So I think we're starting those conversations, recognizing it may take some time for those conversations to ultimately come to fruition.
This is Gary. I just want real quick chime in on that. I agree with the things that everybody's been saying about the curb, and then after this, what it looks like. And back to Raymond's question and even what Mike was just saying, I do think that enforcement and strategies about managing the curb, and you can't manage it without enforcement, are really got to be the priority. And if there are a way to give break in fees in terms of just the actual meter fees, that might be a way, back to Raymond's question again, to help the struggling businesses make a comeback. But, you know, just this morning, I got an email from a local bank president who's received 2 tickets from our team because we turned the meters off, but we're enforcing for 2 hours. And he's trying to plead this case. Well, Gary, we're working on the SBA loans, and I just got busy and didn't move my car. And I'm thinking, didn't you have long-term parking somewhere really close to the bank anyway already? I mean, you weren't parking at meters every day, all day. But now that the meters are free, you know, here's a bank president out there trying to. So my point is, if you don't enforce it all, those folks start showing up and wanting to park all day long or play the move it game. And there's just so much more that needs to happen at the curb than a bank president trying to park all day because he's busy with his busyness. But to Mike's point, I think various permits, maybe less metered spaces, things like that are the things we need to look at.
Yeah, I think kind of there are basic parking and transportation demand management principles that we all know and we've all employed. And now there's this wave of, well, let's just make it all free and make it unrestricted. And I think as long as we're thoughtful about the communication, right? I mean, I'm always tasking my team with whatever we're working on. Let's not appear to come across as tone deaf. Let's understand the situation, but at the same time, our jobs have always been very valuable. They'll continue to be valuable, and we can actually really step up and help folks out in this situation. And as long as we don't lose sight of that, I think we'll be a value add at the table, whether it's parking, transportation, or other citywide initiatives going on. So we obviously have a great team on this line, as well as others, to help all of our cities, universities, and airports get through this. So with that, I think we got a couple of minutes. I think Justin and/or Rachel has a wrap up. I certainly thank everyone for the time, and please, everyone, stay safe and healthy out there. Justin?
All right. Thank you very much, Robert. I want to thank you, Robert, for handling the moderating of our discussion. So this will conclude today's Shop Talk. I would like to invite everyone to continue the conversation at IPMI's forum. You can visit the forum at forum.parking-mobility.org. And also we want to invite everyone to join us for our next 2 Shop Talks, one on April 22nd, and then the one that Rachel mentioned on April 29th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. We want to make sure that everyone stays connected. So please visit our free resource page, Stay Connected. It's parking-mobility.org/stay connected. There we have a COVID-19 information clearinghouse. We are also keeping this in mind for people who have lost their jobs. We are offering free transitional memberships, resume exchange, and then a series of other free resources. The IPMI, we have a list of free IPMI webinars, including the Shop Talks, and the don't forget the parking podcast too. So with that being said, I want to thank everyone for joining us. Today's webinar is copyrighted in 2020. You may now disconnect. Thank you.
Thank you, Justin. Have a great day, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everybody. Thanks.